No one expected Thomas Sowell to matter. Not the professors. Not the politicians. And certainly not the media. Born into poverty, raised without a father, dropping out of high school, working menial jobs just to survive. Thomas Sowell looked like someone history would quietly forget. But history had other plans. Because decades later, this same man would become one of the most cited economists, social critics, and political thinkers in modern American history. A man whose ideas would challenge universities, anger activists, and quietly influence generations of policymakers, without ever chasing fame. Thomas Sowell did not shout. He did not march. He did not beg for attention. He simply wrote. And what he wrote made people uncomfortable. Because Sowell asked questions most people were afraid to ask. Questions about race. About culture. About government. About incentives. About whether good intentions actually lead to good results. And perhaps most dangerously of all, he backed those questions with data. In a world driven by emotion, Sowell insisted on evidence. In a culture obsessed with slogans, he demanded logic. And in an era where conformity was rewarded, he chose independence. This is not a story about left versus right. This is not a story about politics. This is a story about a man who refused to lie to himself, even when the truth cost him friends, status, and acceptance. This is the story of Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell was born in 1930, in Gastonia, North Carolina. A time and place where being poor was hard, and being black made it even harder. He never knew his father. His mother died when he was still a child. By the age of 9, Sowell was sent to Harlem, New York, to live with a great aunt. Harlem was not the romanticized cultural hub people talk about today. It was loud, crowded, and unforgiving. Money was scarce. Opportunities were limited. And survival came before dreams. School was not a priority, not because Sowell lacked intelligence, but because life demanded practicality. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. At a time when education was becoming the gateway to success, Thomas Sowell stepped off the path entirely. He worked as a delivery boy, a machine shop helper, a laborer. These jobs did not teach him ideology. They taught him reality. He saw how people responded to incentives. He noticed how rules changed behavior. He observed how good intentions often produced unintended consequences. But no one was listening. And for a long time, Sowell didn't speak. In Harlem, he learned something that would shape his entire philosophy later in life. That culture matters. That values matter. That behavior matters. And that poverty is not just about money. It is about habits, expectations, and the invisible rules people live by. Years later, many critics would accuse Sowell of being out of touch with the poor. But they never knew this part of his life. They never knew that he had lived it. In his early adulthood, Thomas Sowell believed in Marxism. This fact surprises many people today, especially those who see him only as a conservative thinker. But Sowell did not begin with skepticism toward government power. He began with hope. Like many young intellectuals of his generation, he believed that inequality was the result of exploitation. That poverty existed because systems were unjust. That with the right policies, the right leaders, and the right intentions, society could be redesigned into something fair. At the University of Chicago, where Sowell studied economics, he was surrounded by brilliant minds. Ideas were debated fiercely. Theories were admired. But something bothered him. The numbers did not match the promises. Policies that sounded compassionate often produced outcomes that harmed the very people they claimed to help. Rent control reduced housing availability. Minimum wage laws reduced employment opportunities. Welfare programs discouraged long-term independence. These were not theories. They were measurable effects. Sowell's breaking point came during his time working as an intern for the U.S. Department of Labor. There, he was assigned to analyze data on minimum wage increases. The expectation was clear: prove that raising wages helped workers. Instead, the data showed something else entirely. Teen unemployment rose. Entry-level jobs disappeared. Small businesses cut hours or closed positions altogether. When Sowell presented these findings, the response was not curiosity. It was hostility. The conclusion had already been decided. The data was simply supposed to support it. That was the moment Sowell realized something profound. Many policies are not designed to help people. They are designed to feel good to those who support them. And from that realization, Thomas Sowell never looked back. Thomas Sowell went on to study at Harvard University, then Columbia University, then returned to the University of Chicago. By all conventional standards, he had made it. But success did not bring acceptance. In academic circles, Sowell was increasingly seen as a problem. He refused to align with fashionable ideas. He challenged assumptions others took for granted. While many intellectuals asked, what should be done? Sowell asked, compared to what? That question alone made him dangerous. At Harvard, Sowell observed something unsettling. Many theories were protected not because they were correct, but because they were popular. Disagreeing did not just risk being wrong, it risked social exile. He noticed that ideas were judged less by evidence and more by who they offended. Over time, Sowell developed what would become the core of his intellectual framework. Incentives matter more than intentions. Trade-offs are unavoidable. Every policy has costs, even when those costs are hidden. And history is the ultimate test of any idea. This way of thinking made him deeply unpopular in many academic spaces. Not because he lacked credentials, but because he used them honestly. Eventually, Sowell left traditional academia. Not in defeat, but in clarity. He joined the Hoover Institution, where he would spend decades writing without censorship, without political pressure, and without compromise. Free from institutional expectations, Sowell became what universities could not tolerate: an independent thinker. Thomas Sowell never set out to frighten institutions. But truth has a way of doing that. What made Sowell dangerous was not anger, not outrage, not even ideology. It was clarity. He dismantled popular narratives slowly, calmly, and with evidence. And institutions built on narratives cannot survive scrutiny. Sowell challenged the belief that government programs are inherently benevolent. He questioned whether expanding bureaucracies actually serve the poor. And most controversially, he argued that unequal outcomes do not automatically prove injustice. Under Sowell's lens, the real question was never, who feels wronged? It was, what actually happened after this policy was implemented? He compared countries. He compared time periods. He compared cultures. And what he found was deeply inconvenient. Affirmative action, Sowell argued, often helped middle-class minorities more than the poor. Welfare programs, while well-intentioned, frequently trapped families in long-term dependency. Public education systems rewarded conformity, not excellence. These arguments were not popular, but they were supported by decades of historical data. And institutions that thrive on moral authority do not tolerate challenges to their effectiveness. Sowell was labeled many things: insensitive, reactionary, outdated. But rarely was he disproven. If Thomas Sowell were asked to analyze modern America, he would not begin with headlines. He would begin with incentives. Inflation, under Sowell's lens, is not mysterious. It is the predictable result of excessive government spending, monetary expansion, and political short-term thinking. When governments print money, they do not create wealth. They dilute it. The cost is not paid immediately. It is paid quietly, by workers, by savers, by retirees. On housing, Sowell would not blame greed. He would point to zoning laws, rent controls, and regulatory barriers that reduce supply. Good intentions, bad outcomes. On crime, Sowell would resist emotional narratives. He would examine policy shifts, policing incentives, and cultural attitudes toward accountability. He often warned that when society removes consequences, it does not remove behavior. It removes responsibility. And on education, Sowell would ask why systems designed to help children so often fail the poorest among them. His conclusion would be uncomfortable, but consistent. You cannot solve problems by ignoring how people actually behave. Thomas Sowell paid a price for intellectual independence. He was rarely invited to mainstream media panels. His books were praised quietly, criticized loudly, and debated endlessly. But Sowell never chased validation. He believed that the role of an intellectual was not to be liked, but to be right, or at least, honest. Even in retirement, Sowell continued to write. Not to persuade everyone, but to preserve clarity in an increasingly noisy world. Today, his influence lives on not through viral clips, but through ideas that refuse to die. Ideas about trade-offs, about responsibility, about the limits of power. Under Thomas Sowell's lens, the world does not become simpler. It becomes clearer, and clarity is often the most radical thing of all.